Big thank you to Omni Heroes for sponsoring today's video. Hajime no Ippo. You might have heard of it. This legendary sports manga penned by the equally legendary Joji Morikawa follows the life and career of the titular Ippo Makunouchi, who takes up boxing in the hopes of answering the burning question, what does it mean to be strong? It started serialization on October 11th, 1989, has sold over 100 million copies, and that's about everything I know about this story because, despite its worldwide popularity and critical acclaim, Hajime no Ippo hasn't been officially released in English. This might not make sense to some of you, but to me it's important that I review stories that are available to be supported, simply because I truly believe in fair use. And in order to avoid being a hypocrite, that means I have to stick to fair use principles when they both suit me and when they don't. I've wanted to cover this story for years, but it wasn't available in English, so I never covered it. Until today. Right now you can read Hajime no Ippo through K-Manga Kodansha's website. They have taken it upon themselves to be the first organization to officially localize this world-famous manga for all of us English speakers. Currently, only 87 chapters of the story have been officially localized for us, so it's up to you guys to show this series the support it needs to reach the finish line. Oh, and did I mention that as of writing this video, Hajime no Ippo has over 1,400 chapters to its name. For years now, the longest manga I've ever reviewed on this channel has been One Piece by a wide margin, but when you compare these two stories, well, let's just say in terms of length, it's not even close. I'm thrilled to finally say that I, Mark Fitzpatrick, today will be sharing my first impressions of, thoughts on, and blind review for the inspirational, relentless, and legendary story of Hajime no Ippo. Hajime no Ippo is a titan of a manga, not just in its length as it's obvious, but in terms of the requisite analysis one needs to implement in order to effectively break it down. Normally, the fashion with which I write these video essay reviews is by reading sections one piece at a time, taking notes as I go, and concluding on a predetermined chapter, after which I unpack and make sense of my time reading, resulting in a script that's partially analysis, partially semi-live reaction, and commentary. This did not work for Hajime no Ippo. Why? Well, because I had too much to say, and it was boring. So instead, I've taken a new approach. As I write what you are hearing right now, I have read every single chapter officially available to us as English speakers, and moreover, everything I will be covering in this video has already been read by me. And now, armed with that knowledge, I want to once again attempt to explain my complicated feelings concerning Hajime no Ippo, because while in some ways it's exactly what I had hoped for, in other ways, it's remarkably different. Introduction no Ippo. As a reviewer, when I consume a new piece of media, one of the most exciting sections of the story to cover has been the introduction. How a story establishes itself can tell you not only a lot about the world and cast, but can also tell you where this story might ultimately be going and how it will go there. This is why when it comes to stories like One Piece and Naruto, I spent a lot of time looking at the characterization of Luffy and Naruto themselves as the story unfolded alongside the authors that wrote them. And Hajime no Ippo was a roller coaster. The story begins with our titular character Ippo as we see him go about his unfulfilling day-to-day life. He's a kind-hearted, shy and meek student that diligently helps out with his widowed mother's fishing business and gets beaten up on the regular by the usual suspects. It's during one of those routine beatdowns that a jogging boxer by the name of Takamura stumbles upon this lopsided confrontation to make the save on the young Ippo. And from here, it's pretty straightforward to see what happens. Ippo thanks Takamura and seeks out what he knows. Takamura offers him a chance to prove himself by catching leaves that fall from a tree, and then introduces him to the gym he trains at. It's a tale as old as time. This, however, is the very first time I've ever read a sports manga, and more than that, it's the very first time I've ever read a boxing-centric comic. I've been a massive fan of boxing all of my life, both keeping up with it alongside my father in real life, watching films inspired by it, and even dabbling in a handful of classes here and there myself. I've got great respect for the sport both from a competitive and storytelling standpoint. You need look no further than the Rocky and Creed films to see how well positioned this sport is to tell captivating and human stories. And needless to say, these were the expectations I had coming into this series. However, as I learned, nothing about Hajime no Ippo played out how I expected it to. And while there are still many big events still to come for Ippo in this story, I want to take a moment to talk about a very exciting event coming up with the sponsor of today's video, Omni Heroes. If you're somehow not aware, this game is an immensely popular strategy RPG that's currently taking the Google Play and App Store by storm. Players are tasked with rescuing a series of captive Valkyries from the demons at large, and to do so, well, you're going to be summoning all kinds of insanely well-designed heroes. Putting these teams together unlocks synergies that provides crazy awesome buffs to your party. It's simple enough on the surface for anyone who wants to kick back and unwind, but if you want some meaty depth, just know that this game has over 100 team comps. You can also earn rewards passively thanks to the automated mechanics system, so if you ever need a break, just kick back and the rewards will come straight to you. Heck, you can even use the quick battle option to skip over fights to earn rewards even faster. There are just so many different ways to play based on what suits you best. On November 17th, Omni Heroes is hosting its Ashen Phantom event that not only drops in sick new story, but also delivers brand new roguelike dungeon gameplay. Now is a great time to dive in, and if you use my link in the description, you can claim 777 free summons and 5 legendary heroes all within the first week. Once again, the link is in the description, and I hope you have fun. As I outlined, the beginning of Hajime no Ippo follows a very familiar structure akin to many coming-of-age, combat-centric films of the 80s and 90s. However, despite laying the groundwork for a dramatic or emotional story, what with a friendless kid with a struggling mother being our main character, Hajime no Ippo didn't take the route I thought it would. Where One Piece focused on establishing and bonding us to the character of Luffy, Hajime no Ippo doesn't spend as much time bonding us to the young Ippo necessarily. Instead, and to my surprise, a tremendous amount of time is spent familiarizing the audience with the real star of this series, boxing. To the uninitiated, boxing can at times appear mindlessly violent and, well, sort of boring. With two buff individuals exchanging near misses, holding each other against the ropes, grunting exhaustively, depending on the fight, it can be a hard sell. But like any complicated video game, without first understanding the rules, personalities, or strategies involved, it can be a slog to sit through, as any newbie watching the likes of StarCraft or Valorant might tell you. And this is why more traditional battle shonen stories typically leave the martial arts rather vague, utilizing more simplistic power systems that in turn offer up a more traditional and flexible means of injecting complexity into these fights. Whether that be Dragon Ball's Ki, One Piece's Devil Fruits, Naruto's Jutsu, Hunter x Hunter's Nen, or any other popular and thoughtfully designed power system, the benefits are there for all of us to see quite clearly. Hajime no Ippo has no such power system. Where other shonen stories utilize elements and philosophies from the martial arts that have inspired them, I don't think I've ever come across a fighting-centric shonen so faithfully representing the sport it's taken inspiration from. And as a quick aside, coming from a guy who's really into Dragon Ball, I am utterly bamboozled by just how much this manga and Morikawa, the author, understands not just boxing, but the extremely fine details of the sport. Details that come into focus the moment that we and Ippo walk into Takamura's boxing gym. Details that become exposed the moment Ippo is tested with a spar to prove himself against this gym's promising new prospect, MIYATA. Thus far in this story, all we've seen is unorthodox training offered up by Takamura to Ippo, manifesting in him just punching at some leaves. And despite this being the first eventual bout we get to see from Ippo, it is absolutely not the last we'll see, or even a rare occurrence. Contained in the material I'm covering today is a long laundry list of fights, each one better than the last, climaxing at an event I won't touch on yet because we've got this fight to contend with first, and what's more is, we need to understand how boxing works first and foremost. Ippo versus MIYATA. Ippo vs. MIYATA and the rivalry that's established here is the mechanism with which carries us through the story for the most part. It's a story that's told through a sequence of fights climaxing at one pivotal moment in time, and it all begins here. One of the multitude of reasons I enjoy analyzing the beginnings of and introductions to stories is that they normally establish all of the key players for the impending story, as well as define the current situations or goals of the cast we're following. In other words, Luffy wants to be the Pirate King, Goku wants to fight strong guys and get stronger himself, Naruto wants to become Hokage, and Gon wants to find his father. For the most part, these are all easily understood goals for us to get behind, and moreover, they hint towards what the story will be about later. This is what Ippo vs. MIYATA offers this story to an extent. And if my saying "to an extent" sticks out to you, well, it should, because it's precisely what threw me so off balance when reading this story for the first time. And boy oh boy do I have my thoughts on that. The relationship and rivalry established between MIYATA and Ippo in this introduction takes place across two bouts. This initially half-hearted and ill-prepared for spar, and the sequel to it, which receives a lot more attention, build-up, and preparation. For all intents and purposes, MIYATA is the opposite of Ippo in every way presently. He comes from boxing lineage. He's trained his entire life, is naturally gifted in ways Ippo isn't. He's confident, and as we soon come to discover, has an entirely different style of fighting to the straightforward pressure fighter Ippo naturally falls into. But does that matter? This is the moment Ippo shows us at home and those in the gym he's trying to gain the favor of what makes him so special. And no one is more surprised at this level of tenacity than the prodigy MIYATA. MIYATA is forced to utilize his speciality, the counterpunch, to put Ippo away. The unobservant in the crowd see this as a clear-cut victory for MIYATA, but the more keen-eyed understood the truth. MIYATA was indeed contending with a newbie, but that newbie possessed more natural strength and grit than he was comfortable with. And while this show of heart might have gone unnoticed by some, the head coach and owner of the gym took notice. He wants to give Ippo a chance and a rematch with MIYATA once they both have adequately prepared. Ippo vs. MIYATA II. Alright, it's time for the rematch. Ippo vs. MIYATA II, and let me tell you, this one is better, like way better. And I say way better because this was the fight where everything Morikawa was going for sort of clicked with me in this story. Allow me to explain. This is the first round of the rematch. MIYATA, despite training in earnest these past few months for Ippo, despite having worked on the sport for years, finds himself flat on his ass. Following this stunningly depicted 1-2 combo from Ippo, this page is fantastic, you can see MIYATA's shock and everyone's surprise plastered across their respective faces. Their reactions take up as much real estate on this page as the knockdown itself. But when you turn the page, we discover that no one is more shocked than Ippo himself. Look at that expression. It's a moment that speaks to the culmination of the past 3 months worth of perseverance, an application of hard work, natural ability, passion, and, most importantly, thoughtful strategy. And what's more is that this fight was perfect. But the strange thing to me was, I didn't understand why upon first reading. But now, I understand what happened. In short, I think this story works best if you have no prior knowledge of how boxing works going in. Because Morikawa adores the sport, and through this manga, he will hold your hand and guide you through everything you need to know about it. Everything from the rules of the sport, to the philosophies and approach, all the way to the multitude and minutiae of details in punching technique and counters to specific styles. And all throughout this introductory section, like I did with all the aforementioned shonen I've covered in the past, I was waiting for that moment where Ippo and I would really connect, where I discovered my reason for wanting to spend this time with this character. But that never really came, which I learned is exactly why Ippo is the perfect character for this section of the story. Ippo doesn't begin this story with the goal of being the greatest boxer of all time. He doesn't need to stab himself in the eye, eat a devil fruit, and endeavor to be the Pirate King. He doesn't need to become Hokage or seek out any other fantastical accolades the popular protagonists of Shonen's Hall of Fame have reached for. Instead, through Ippo being reserved, by him being on the surface unremarkable, he aligns himself with every kid that might read this story one day. And with a story being as grounded in the fundamentals of boxing as Hajime no Ippo is, through that lens we can appreciate what Morikawa wants to do with this story. And it's not necessarily entertain those like me who are fans of boxing already, because we already know the rules. We know what shadowboxing is. We already know why boxing is great. Instead, Morikawa wants to encourage a young and eager generation to try out this incredible sport for themselves, and it's incredibly effective. This moment is the culmination of everything I've learned about this story. Ippo's character doesn't reveal himself through dialogue really, or through the choices he makes necessarily, at least not in an impactful way just yet. Instead, his character is revealed through moments where his training, boxing, and proper technique all come together in a stunningly perfect moment on the page. Look at this page! Tell me Ippo didn't just steal Miyata's soul with this move. Look at his face! He can't believe it! And this isn't your typical shonen strong boy eats a full-blown punch because he's a shonen strong boy. Nope! This is what happens in the real world when you time your movement to receive a punch at its weakest point. It's an incredibly clever move, and this page demonstrates just that. Through wonderful moment-to-moment paneling as Miyata's eyes slowly look up to see what he's just opened himself up for, we turn the page and wham! This page gave me chills. The perfect setup to the prior page, the outstanding gestural drawings, the wonderful reaction shots, and ample use of white space to not crowd the panels. Morikawa knows what he's doing. And I hope it goes without saying, but one of the most important things for this series to get right is the fighting and various boxing matches, and holy hell does Morikawa knock it out of the park in a fashion I've not yet seen put to paper. Stylistically, you can see a lot of influence from the likes of Fist of the North Star and early JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. Despite this, however, Ippo comes with a distinct Morikawa twist that injects a lot of expressive stylized humor and strong gestural drawings to grant the story its own sense of identity, to communicate the action and effectively translate the true techniques being implemented, because that's what it's there for, to teach us how boxing works. Where Dragon Ball can get away with animators guessing how martial arts stances and strikes work, Hajime no Ippo depends on Morikawa's extensive knowledge of not just human anatomy and gestural drawing, but the specific technical inner workings of boxing, as so much of how this fight and all the others that follow it function is through his accurate application of boxing's rules and practices. This is the character-defining and series-defining moment I was waiting for. And while it took a little longer to arrive than I thought it would, it certainly arrived with a punch more spectacular and exciting than I was anticipating. Miyata vs. Ippo 2 is wonderful not just for those aforementioned reasons, but is important for the story to function. For in addition to defining the series and its lead character for us, with Miyata deciding to leave in the wake of this result, we have our next goal. Miyata wants their tiebreaker fight to be at the finals of the upcoming rookie boxing tournament. At the moment, Ippo only really knows how to fight Miyata. It's what he's specifically trained for. And to get to the rookie tournament, Ippo will need to obtain a pro boxing license and survive a long series of qualifying and preliminary rounds against some of Japan's best prospects. Can he do it? Let's find out. License no Ippo. Kicking off this section and introducing us to what the real world of professional boxing has in store for the young Ippo, we get to witness the highly touted greatness of Takamura as he takes on the third-ranked Japanese middleweight Kazuhiko Hirano. The fight itself is great, but what it demonstrates is that what goes into winning a boxing match isn't simply the technique or natural abilities applied in the ring during the allotted rounds, but instead the torturous weight cuts, sleepless nights, pressure, and workouts put in the days, weeks, and months leading up to a particular fight. I've only been reading this story for about 2 weeks now, and I'll be honest, I might be jumping the gun here, but I feel like this is a character, Takamura, that most don't love enough. You might love him, but if you do, I don't think you love him enough. At least not the way that I do. Beyond what he means to Ippo as the catalyst which introduces boxing into his life, beyond his upbeat, energetic, and engaging character, with far more depth than many of the main cast, there's a subtlety to Takamura that quickly became my favorite part of this story. Takamura wins his fight against the third-ranked middleweight with ease because, well, he's Takamura and that's what he does. But there won't be many opportunities for me to talk about him during this video, so I'll say it here. Had it not been for Takamura, I may not have kept reading this story as I have. The beginning of this manga is very effective at capturing the feeling of a gripping boxing match, at selling the sport to a younger audience. It offers a tone of appreciation to the sport and all that good stuff, but I already had that going in. What I needed was a character to latch onto, and while there's plenty to find endearing about Ippo, I just never found anything too relatable with him. Interestingly, the anime adaptation of this story seems to have taken the initiative in changing or adding things to this story, and one of the additions was to offer more time for us as an audience to bond with Ippo as a character near the beginning. This is all to say that I'm sure my experience with the character of Ippo might have been different had I decided to take the anime on instead of the manga. But as I stood at this point in the story, I liked Ippo, but I didn't love him, and that became increasingly the case as time passed on in the story. However, through all of that, Takamura was the exciting, boisterous, entertaining, and dubious character I could see a lot of my younger self in, one that fit the more conventional mold of a shonen protagonist. He's a brilliant addition to the story, and his greatest contributions are yet to be seen. So yeah, this is the physical application process for the boxing licenses. This is Mashiba, and he's a little bit of a psychopath. And with him, Morikawa establishes a pattern of exposition that he'll make use of for the remainder of this video. Each and every fighter that will eventually stand in a prominent position within a boxing ring will have a unique style or trademark attack or approach that allows us at home to learn more about boxing, through not only showcasing unique techniques, but also showing how opponents plan to counter. And that's a built-in point of interest in the sport of boxing. You may have heard people utter the phrase, "styles make fights," and that reflects the approach Morikawa is taking here. Each style demands something to counter it effectively, and depending on what style the other fighter is comfortable with, opens us up to a host of different approaches and possibilities a particular fight can take. With MIYATA, he was a counterpuncher, and with Mashiba, it was the flicker jab. And as Ippo easily cruises through his license exam on the horizon, he has 2 fights. Fights he must win to qualify for the upcoming rookie tournament. There's not much to them, and they really serve only one purpose each, so I'll keep it quick. Ippo versus Oda. With this fight, Morikawa establishes another pattern that I have mixed feelings on. Oda is a 21-year-old fighter with an okay record. Having started his career with a promising punch, he became lazy and dependent on that one move. We get to see a lot of his backstory and motivations coming into the fight, as well as the emotional struggle he undergoes to truly get ready for this fight against Ippo, lest he lose everything. I suppose the fight itself could be a cautionary tale for Ippo not to get complacent or rely on what worked for him in the past, and the match itself is dramatic and forces Ippo to push himself considerably, all the while teaching Oda the value of hard work in the sport of boxing. Long story short, Ippo wins. Next fight. Ippo versus Fujiwara. Ippo versus Fujiwara is even more simple than the prior. With the bullies from Chapter 1 now having learned of Ippo's pro status in boxing, they start to develop a greater respect for him and even go to see his next fight. Fujiwara is Ippo's opponent, and he's effectively the thematic stand-in for the bullies watching on. Fujiwara implements a host of different dirty tactics during the match, trying to bully Ippo too. But the difference here between Ippo in Chapter 1 and Ippo now is that Ippo isn't having any of it. Ippo wins by knockout in round 1, and through that gains a bunch of new supporters in his former bullies. And with that, Ippo is now qualified for the rookie tournament, where he may now meet the 2-0 Mashiba, and where he hopes to face his rival MIYATA in the finals of the tournament. Currently, MIYATA seems to be the favorite. His record now stands at 3 wins to 0. Rookie Tournament No Ippo. This is the longest, most complete, and it is the final stretch of the story I'll be covering. It's the East Japan Rookie Tournament, and in order to fulfill his promise to rematch MIYATA in the finals, Ippo needs to win 4 separate matches. The first of which being Round 1, Jason OZUMA versus Ippo. Generally speaking, I won't have too much to say on these early contests. They offer some great matches to read through, and I highly encourage you to do so, but this one in particular though, where do I even begin? You see, Jason OZUMA is African American, and this manga was written in 1989. Maybe you see where I'm going with this. It's funny though. The way you think this could go wrong is actually the exact opposite of how things actually end up going. OZUMA is introduced, and it becomes clear very quickly that Morikawa has a deep respect and adoration for black boxers. It's only natural given how Central American boxing is to the boxing world, with famous fighters like Mike Tyson and Sugar Ray Leonard making headlines across the globe consistently. But the problem is that, well, I think primarily as a product of its time, that reverence he has for them loops back around to being offensive again. OZUMA is talked about as a natural fighter, with talk of his African American heritage giving him a natural evolutionary advantage. How fun. And here I am, wading through a chapter or two of awkwardness of 1989 Morikawa waxing poetically about biological advantages, when all of a sudden, out of nowhere, I am greeted by literal blackface gag. Holy shit. I swear to God, this reveal is a literal jump scare at the end of chapter 28. It is nuts. But thankfully, as I alluded to earlier, none of this extremely dated depiction of race is in bad faith as best I can tell. It comes across as being very dated, but in a way that tries to depict Jason in the most reverent light possible, rather than being based out of any prejudice that I can tell. Which is good, but still, woof, literal blackface. All of that aside, the character of Jason OZUMA might be the most righteous and lovable in the series so far, though we do never see him again after this. Jason is a friendly, kind, and talented young soldier stationed in Japan that loves boxing. He's a natural talent, and Ippo finds his outward appearance intimidating. The anime naturally changes this. Instead of his appearance being intimidating, it's his nationality as an American that does it, which makes more sense as there's a larger boxing culture in that country. And of course, they cut Aoki's blackface, thank God. Yikes. In this bout, we learn that Jason is fighting on behalf of his community and family up north in Japan that need help paying for supplies. It paints a sad situation and becomes one of several fights in the series where I felt as though I was cheering for and related to Ippo's opponents more than I did Ippo himself. I'm not sure if that was intentional or not, but that was my experience. At any rate, Jason vs. Ippo was a very competitive fight, with both sides going back and forth applying pressure and skill. There's a moment at the beginning of the fight after Jason scores a knockdown on Ippo where the way Morikawa draws the panels, we are led to believe Ippo would fall again, thus TKOing him out of the tournament. It's an exciting bout and probably the most engaging fight the series has seen thus far. The quarterfinals, KOBASHI vs. Ippo. There's significantly less to say about this fight, and it's really just another bout where Ippo is faced with another style of opponent to overcome in a unique fashion. KOBASHI isn't a technical fighter or a power puncher, but instead a strategic one. He studies his opponent's style to create the perfect way to neutralize their approach in order for him to win on points. And in a similar fashion to many of the fights prior, we spend most of the lead up following KOBASHI and watching Ippo train. However, there is another element to the training section of this fight that I found interesting and compelling. Ever since Takamura last fought against the rank 3 middleweight, he's been chomping at the bit to get another fight, and during this build-up they finally land him another gig. And this time, it's the Japanese middleweight title, the largest honor Takamura's gym has seen in over a decade. However, prior to this good news, you could see his frustration build and build. Never wavering in his support of Ippo, of course, but clearly frustrated at his own situation, with it acting as a mechanism that teaches us about the politics of the boxing world, the real boxing world. The best don't necessarily always fight the best. Instead, sometimes the best avoid certain fighters despite their merits in order to hang on to titles longer. It's great that he finally got another fight lined up, but at the same time, I was aware that this was yet another time Morikawa was demonstrating amidst the list of easily obtained fights Ippo was receiving, he's still worlds away from where Takamura is at. Nevertheless, the coach encourages Ippo to follow Takamura in preparation for KOBASHI during his training camp, within which they discover a weakness in Ippo's game, one that he remedies right away through targeted training. And as a quick aside, prior to the quarterfinals fight with KOBASHI, Ippo is interviewed within school for some college thing. And it really made me focus on how I'm not sure if I'm fond of Ippo as I should be. He doesn't really seem to have any obvious flaws beyond his own meekness, which would be okay, but he always seems to be pitted, as of late, against these underdogs or sympathetic characters. I mean, if we stop to think about it, Ippo's a naturally gifted power puncher, has a mom that supports his vocation entirely and isn't struggling for money. We never see him do anything but work on his boxing, but in this interview, we learn that his grades are also good enough to get into any college he wants, and the only running joke made at his expense is that he has a massive schlong. One of the first things he learns about boxing was that not every fight is glamorous, that the undercard fights are normally in front of empty seats, and this reflects reality. I love that Morikawa pointed this out early on. But yet, no matter the lack of notoriety his name brings or his opponent brings, all of his fights every single time seem to be in front of what appears to be a sold-out crowd. This never happens. Compare that to the audience of Aoki's headliner fight, and the bleachers are totally empty. It all just seems a little lopsided, and at this point, I was starting to feel a clear favoritism for Ippo with every passing chapter, as if his time in boxing is being glamorized to a point that doesn't really reflect reality anymore, and that aspect of the story was what I really respected about it early on. In the end, Ippo, through difficulty, overcomes Kobashi for the win. As characters go, Kobashi was again another character I found an emotional connection with, as he didn't really think he measured up to anyone he fought. His style was one born from insecurity and a lack of confidence in his own abilities. The fight was great, and I think I was cheering for Kobashi all the more during it. The Japanese middleweight title, Takamura vs YAJIMA. This fight, and indeed the fallout from it, are what cemented Takamura as my favorite character in this story, and what's more is offered, in addition to some wonderful action, a subtle and compelling story of a man trying to live up to the ideals he set for himself and other people despite the toll it's taking on his body. In the story of Hajime no Ippo early on, there's a clear sentiment expressed by Morikawa through the likes of Ippo's coach and owner of Takamura's gym, that he feels Japan is falling off on the world stage in terms of boxing. Unlike the United States or other countries, Japan has never had a world champion. And unlike the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the future doesn't look too promising as boxing has become less popular in Japan. Takamura, however, is the embodiment of the sort of change and determination Morikawa wants to see from his country. A strong, talented, and tenacious fighter that before he steps in to fight the biggest match of his life, says that this Japanese title is nothing but a simple stepping stone. The fight itself offers Takamura more trouble than he's ever seen before, but even then, he summons from within deep reserves of strength and bravery to stand back up and unleash hell onto his opponent to win the fight convincingly in the first round. This is all to say, within this story, Takamura is more than just a man, he's a symbol of what could be in Japan. The younger folks in the gym all look up to him, as well as those all from around Japan. But there is a crack in his armor, and honestly, seeing it was my favorite part of the 88 chapters I read this week. Returning with Ippo from the title win and his celebration, Takamura is talking as normal, when suddenly, as he starts to march up his steps towards his apartment, for the first time we see him falter. He stumbles, still affected by the clash he just came out on top of. This is all to say that while Takamura bills himself as this titan and eater of worlds, and while others see him as a symbol of hope for Japan on the boxing world stage, this scene reminded us all of just how human he truly is. And like everyone alive today, he too has limits. The semi-finals, Hayami versus Ippo. Up until this point, while I have enjoyed the fights at face value, Hajime no Ippo has taken a specific and repeated approach to the fights and opponents Ippo's faced. We find out who Ippo is facing, do some research on their background, styles, weaknesses, etc., and then get to work training up Ippo on how to best counter them. Usually the odds are stacked against him, but Through sheer will and careful planning, Ippo is able to overcome the odds and beat his opponents. And the training that leads up to that is certainly not something that is hand-waved away. In fact, the training sections leading up to the fights is some of the best material in these early chapters, in my opinion. Whether it be the interesting training on the beach leading up to the KOBASHI fight, or any of the other lead-ups to Ippo's previous wins, they all take their time to explore a new facet of Ippo's boxing in a way that is not only easy to understand, but also interesting and engaging. However, Ippo's fight against Hayami offers us our first real shake-up to this formula, and revealed to me personally many of the strengths of this series as well as some of its most apparent weaknesses. The established trend of learning deeply about an upcoming opponent is fine, but as I read through this fight in particular, it became clear that it created a bizarre dynamic between the audience and Ippo that I felt may not have served the story as well as it otherwise could have. An atmosphere where we at home feel we understand both fighters better than they understand each other. Of course, the idea is that these tense relations help bond us to Ippo and create an occasion for us to cheer for him, but I feel like learning these things through preemptive dialogue scenes and backstory delves serves that much worse than through the alternative, action. Not the story term, I mean real, fist-on-fist action. And we see that so clearly with Takamura's previous bout. We don't know too much about the opponent going into the fight, and even further, we are not given as much insight on Takamura's internal turmoil leading up to the occasion. But as the two enter the ring, as well as afterwards, the various folds in both opponents' characters began to naturally show themselves. Why? Because fighting introduces one of the most important elements in storytelling: pressure. Think back to something like, say, Frieza in Dragon Ball. As we are introduced to him, we get a general sense of his personality and demeanor through some of his actions and interactions with others on Namek. Enough that we don't feel in the dark about him as a character, but that all begins to greatly change as soon as Frieza is pitted against Goku. Someone who for the first time in this story is able to apply pressure to Frieza. That very pressure naturally allows Toriyama to bring out the true facets of Frieza's character, his psychopathy, his cruelty, his cowardice, and unveil entirely new depths to him. By the end, the majority of what we know about his true character is learned in the midst of his fight with Goku. And that is what makes fighting such a great conduit for storytelling. Its natural ability to squeeze characters until something of worth pops out. And while Hajime no Ippo has utilized some of this with other fights like MIYATA early on or Fujiwara to a lesser extent in its cheating, in the grand scheme of things it tends to put the brunt of its character exploration in preemptive exposition rather than pressure through action. But again, this fight with Hayami is different. Ippo goes into his training learning details of Hayami's signature techniques and takes to an incredibly rigorous amount of training to prep for the bout. But unlike previous fights, a surprising amount of this training takes place off-screen. When the fight night arrives, Ippo arrives too with a thoroughly bruised face, a product of that unseen training. The opponent he is facing this time is, without a doubt, the toughest he has faced so far. With only a narrow chance of victory, he has dedicated his entire body and soul to training up on his counter to Hayami's signature shotgun-style fighting. And as the fight begins, and Ippo's training begins to pay off, everything changes. Hayami, the prodigy boxer known only for his famous shotgun style, takes it upon himself to switch styles completely, to meet Ippo on his own turf, and begins infighting, the same style Ippo uses. This single decision completely upends the established structure of these fights so far. Ippo has only trained for one possible outcome, beating Hayami's shotgun technique through his developed counter. But now that is all out the window. None of it is in play anymore. Therefore, Ippo is forced to freestyle his way through this fight against a superior opponent. And the pressure is on. In fact, the pressure is on for both fighters now. Hayami is the favored winner, but he is now, by his own choice to show his own abilities off, fighting Ippo in his own stylistic territory. That is not an easy task, no matter how good you are. And it doesn't take long before the pressure builds to a head as Ippo finds himself against the metaphorical ropes. Hayami goes in for a finishing uppercut and... oh my god, Ippo landed it! Wait, it didn't work? This is what makes the Hayami fight stand out amongst all the others to me. It's got an added dimension to it. The strategy Ippo has been toiling away at perfecting has hit its mark and dealt considerable damage, but even that wasn't enough to grant Ippo his win. For a second time, the rug has been pulled out from beneath Ippo, and all he has left is to work out a path to victory with his skills alone. That's awesome, and it's exactly the sort of stuff I wish I saw more of from him. Furthermore, the way this fight has been depicted has been my favorite. There's a tremendous amount of time dedicated to one round this entire fight takes place within. 5 whole chapters chronicle these 3 minutes and the drama contained therein, creating a real sense of tension as well as ebbs and flows. You can feel the sudden rug pull from beneath Ippo, the tenacity it took to claw his way back from that, the effort it takes for him to make the fight competitive again, and you can feel the tide slowly shift in Ippo's favor as Hayami slowly loses his rhythm and falls behind him, resulting in a fantastic series of pages that show Ippo unloading punches almost unconsciously, continuing to do so long after Hayami's face hits the canvas, Ippo's arms still pushing the air around him. At no point does Hayami's inner dialogue either ever suggest his spirit is broken or that he was convinced he had lost. It all comes to a head with a fantastic knockout following a single panel that suggests Hayami might once again regain the upper hand. It's a brilliant fight, the best one I've read in the series, and most importantly, throughout the course of the fight, we learn an incredible amount about the inner character of Hayami as well as Ippo through action. The raw, unfiltered pressure of a good bout allowed the characters to be organically squeezed until something of substance emerged. Never before while reading this manga did I feel more naturally invested in a fight, and never before have I eagerly awaited the return of a fighter into the fray following a loss. Overall, it was tremendous fun, and Ippo advances to the finals where he waits for MIYATA. However, in order for this dream rematch to take place, MIYATA needs to uphold his end of the promise. He needs to overcome an impressive and increasingly unsettling Mashiba, who like Ippo and MIYATA has steamrolled through his opponents to the semi-final matchup. Truth be told, at this point in the story, I wasn't as keen on the idea of MIYATA facing off against Ippo for a third time in the final. I wasn't entirely against it, mind you, but given what we had already seen from Mashiba, I was a little curious what that sort of character might offer Ippo in terms of dynamic in the finals. But I digress. It's time for the last semi-final matchup, and it's a doozy. Oh, and also, time for me to remind you that I recently relaunched my Patreon page to include a whole list of actual perks and exclusive content. We've got behind the scenes outtakes, custom made phone and desktop wallpapers of my weekly thumbnail art, early uploads of my main videos without a single ad, mind you, and we even have exclusive podcast length Q&As, and that isn't even all of it. So if you like what I do and want to support me or get any of those perks, check my Patreon link in the description. The semi-finals, MIYATA versus Mashiba. Something rather curious happens during this fight that I quite literally could never have predicted. Going into this contest, I was hoping for one thing, and by the time the final bell rang, I wanted the opposite. Which fittingly is what I think Morikawa wanted me to feel, but I worried that he may have taken things a little too far, but enough vagalities. The first bell rings and immediately the difference in skill is apparent. MIYATA lands at will, demonstrating tremendous speed and secures a decisive knockdown early on Mashiba, who up until now has had zero trouble with any of his matchups. Similar to what I adored about Hayami versus Ippo, where we got to enjoy character revealing itself through action, this matchup takes it to the next level. Going in, we understand that there's a little bit of bad blood between the two fighters, but only from a passing barb sent from Mashiba towards MIYATA's father. From there, it's established who the good and bad guy boxers will be, and how the matchup expands on this during the fight is the very best I've seen from the series concerning this dynamic. While MIYATA is taking the fight seriously, he is not driven specifically by the desire to win the current fight, but rather to fulfill his promise to Ippo and reach the finals for their fated rematch. Despite this theoretical distraction, Mashiba appears like a novice next to MIYATA, who through superior technique, patience, and restraint, when he needs to, has Mashiba on the back foot or on his ass. For pockets of time, we get to see snapshots into the respective fighters' minds during this first round. MIYATA staying collected and focused on the fight to come, all the while Mashiba can't emotionally contend with what is happening right now, willing himself to stand up to MIYATA only for him to be outclassed with ease time and again. This was such a fantastic moment. Through action, it demonstrates that MIYATA was in total control all along, can exercise restraint, and most importantly, wasn't willing to cheat. And that part's important. The second round commences, and unwilling to accept the counsel of his corner, Mashiba rushes in haphazardly, hoping that infighting will get the better of this exceptionally sharp and game MIYATA. Spoiler alert, it won't. In a wonderful moment of dramatic irony, at home we know that Miyata won't be bested by this sloppy approach because he's specifically prepared for an even better infighter, Ippo. This is the first time I've seen a challenged Mashiba, and what was once the character I wanted to see advance for the sake of interest quickly shifted to me rooting against him in favor of the clearly much improved Miyata. That is to say, up until now, Mashiba has demonstrated nothing of worth. Just ignorance, anger, and cowardice in refusing his corner's advice. Pathetically outmatched, Mashiba does the only thing he can. He cheats. In another stunning move of action-revealing character, Mashiba does the unthinkable, compromising Miyata's movement and scoring his first decisive knockdown. If my purview up until now had been slowly shifting in favor of Miyata, at this point I was frustrated beyond belief by how helpless Mashiba was and couldn't envision a world where I'd be satisfied with him advancing to the finals against Ippo. And now with the wings of Miyata clipped for the remainder of this fight, he's faced with a bitter decision at the end of round 2. Throw in the towel and fight another day? Or risk his career by going into the lion's den for round number 3.
Oi, Miyata!
To say that I was cheering for Miyata to somehow pull this out of the bag would be an understatement. Maybe his leg wasn't that bad. Maybe he could find a way to win. If this fight had demonstrated anything, it was that if a path to victory existed, Miyata would find it. He's that good. The entire final round of this fight is orchestrated so dramatically, building to Miyata summoning up the deepest depths of his strength and will to overcome the impossible. Much like he had seen Ippo do time and time again before now, things really do seem impossible for him as he lay knocked down once again on the canvas, energy surging as he finds the will to stand back up, but then he doesn't. He is unable to make the 10 count, and Mashiba is declared the winner, robbing Miyata's rematch from him in the final right under his nose. In the end, I don't know how to feel about this fight entirely. On one hand, Morikawa intentionally built up Miyata tremendously, far beyond where he had already sat. The tragic twist of Ippo's fated rematch was wonderfully executed and threw me for quite a loop, both story-wise as well as internally. Furthermore, he intentionally reinforced Mashiba as an even bigger villain than he was before, but through doing so perhaps degraded his standing as a competent fighter, resulting in significantly less interest from me in seeing him face off against Ippo in the finals. And you know what, that might sound confusing. Surely a clear-cut villain is exactly what makes some of the best final battles so compelling in anime. I mean, I not too long ago praised the astounding fight that was Goku versus Frieza, the ultimate evil. And you're right, under normal circumstances that would be true. And while Mashiba might be more of a villain now, he is one that proved to be a less competent fighter going into this match that required great fighting ability. But perhaps most crucially, a villain can only be as good as the hero he's pitted against. And as I pointed out earlier, I'm not particularly connected to Ippo, but that could still change. This was a genius move in my opinion. For the longest time, my issue with Ippo is that everything seemed to be going his way, that he doesn't ever really encounter any issues unique to him. Everyone has to prepare for tough opponents in boxing, everyone has their own physical weaknesses, but to me, the physical aspect of boxing, while deep and interesting, it's the emotional or human stories that emerge from this sport that make it as compelling as it otherwise stands to be. Rocky I earned Sylvester Stallone an Oscar not because he punched well, but because it told a story of a broken man learning to trust himself and try his best despite the odds. In Rocky II, the line, "Yo Adrian, I did it," rang as emotional to us in our ears because he achieved what he set out to do. He was able to try his best and not allow his mindset or the occasion to compromise his performance. In the case of this manga, Ippo feels cheated out of what he had been working towards all along. And on top of that, in his whirlwind of emotions concerning Miyata's loss and parting message of sorry, this is the most interested I've been in Ippo personally. Unlike other instances where he's demonstrated lukewarm or milquetoast reactions, this time, alone with his thoughts after seeing Miyata stretchered out, he punches a vending machine in anger. smashing it before storming off. It was an anger directed at Mashiba, an anger I've never seen from Ippo. Given that I was less than excited at the thought of someone like Mashiba being built up as the big bad to Ippo's uninteresting hero-type character, I thought leveraging this into a character-revealing moment for the young man is not only much needed, but clever. I've been waiting for a moment of weakness to test Ippo's emotions that will take him to the limit of what he can make sense of. And the circumstances couldn't be more perfect here. A fight against someone that we as an audience know he can defeat, as long as he doesn't let his focus waver or let his emotions get the better of him. This being more than just a physical fight which we've seen Ippo overcome time and again. Instead, it's a fight with Ippo himself to not get in his own way of success. To me, that is a fantastic story for someone as meek and frankly dull as I find Ippo to currently be, and we sort of get just that. Immediately, Ippo begins overtraining, something we have seen him do sort of before, but never to this extreme degree, leading to his hands getting severely damaged in the process, resulting in him being unable to hit the mitts or heavy bag for half of his camp. But this is just one consequence, and while it has lasting effects on his training over the next month to a degree, I was hoping for something more, something that would carry with him into the fight itself against the increasingly desperate Mashiba. A fighter we know that can and likely will test Ippo's patience like no other in the story can. And then we met Mashiba's kind and sympathetic younger sister that Ippo has a crush on. And then we see Mashiba and his sister's unfortunate backstory. And once Ippo's hands are healed, he's 100% focused and totally dialed in to train and perform to the best of his abilities during the fight. The finals, Ippo versus Mashiba. So leading into this fight, it seems like Morikawa had the choice to work this emotionally compromised angle with Ippo and then saw an opportunity to weave his sister into the mix. And in the process, those two plotlines sort of end up getting in the way of each other. Not just by virtue of them having to share half the runtime of this training portion with each other, but by actually getting in the way of each other quite literally. Ippo is driven by vengeance for MIYATA, but he learns about Mashiba's past through his friends and his sister, which naturally puts Ippo into a weird situation. Everyone around him is worried that this revelation with Mashiba's sister, Ippo's longtime crush, will diffuse the fire that has been lit within him. But in quite the surprise, even after hearing of Mashiba's personal life, his relationship with his sister, all of it, he still feels largely the same. He obviously feels awkward about the sister, but he plainly states that none of the information changes how he feels, and is still deeply driven to win, both for his sake as well as MIYATA's. The entire exchange is honestly very muddy. It's hard to tell how we should really feel throughout all of it, but I think at the very least that the turn of having Ippo not bothered by Mashiba's history at all is interesting nevertheless. On a brighter note, there's some really nice paneling leading up to the first bell. Seeing Ippo pensive in the locker room, the moment-to-moment paneling helping to focus our attention on his focused stare across the ring at Mashiba. It's all stunning. Ippo is like a coiled spring ready to unleash the energy he's been waiting to unleash this entire training camp. Ippo starts fast, but can't find his range past Mashiba's reach. This is the story of the early minutes. Ippo manages to keep his cool and employ his weaving peekaboo style effectively to get on the inside of Mashiba, but as he's about to land his first punch, the bell rings. Apparently, the judges score this round 10-9 to Mashiba, which is hilarious considering Ippo had literally no offense for the entire round. He pressured him, sure, he tried to hit him, but he never landed. He landed nothing, and Mashiba seemed to land at will for the majority of the round. In my humble opinion, not being a boxer and not being a boxing judge, that is an easy 10-8 round for Mashiba, and I've seen it being given for less. But what do I know? Round 2 begins, and Mashiba teases a means with which he plans to dispose of Ippo's right straight. The dude blocks with his elbow. Now, I've seen this block applied by the likes of Canelo Alvarez and Mayweather, but never in a million years thought that this approach would be taken in this manga. And I gotta say, that's pretty cool. Ippo's right hand is totally compromised, and with that, my first issue with the creative choices made rear its head. Mashiba is the villain that's not above playing dirty, but this defensive guard is a perfectly legal boxing block. And this is where I think the story of the fight starts to get a little murky. Following the MIYATA fight, it felt as though Morikawa wanted Mashiba to be a well-established villain, one that pushes Ippo to do things he shouldn't. But then we see his backstory and start to sympathize with him. at least a little bit, thus leaving his villain status in lieu of something a bit more complicated. He'll do anything to win a fight, including block with his elbow, which is incredibly hard to do, and through doing so starts to bust up Ippo's right hand. And then, out of nowhere, through Ippo's perseverance in that same round, he seems to snap the ligaments in Mashiba's elbow, effectively reducing him to one arm. At that point, Ippo can land at will. The round ends and I'm just sort of confused as to how I'm supposed to feel. Who am I supposed to be rooting for and why? Emotional complexity is hard nevertheless. However, in the minute between round 2 and 3, this fight interjects one of the most interesting questions to the respective fighters. Ippo's fist is broken and may never recover fully if he keeps punching with it in this round. This is a fascinating way to guide the fight. This is the manga's opportunity to tell a story of doing the responsible thing free of revenge and ego, to not allow others to dictate to you who you are or what your strengths are, to do what's best for you and your future and take the loss. But instead, Ippo grits and bears it, risking his entire future on something that is effectively a stepping stone match. MIYATA did something similar in this bout against Mashiba, and Morikawa is clearly trying to mirror that moment in this fight. But the difference, I think, is that the story with MIYATA's fight called for that moment, but with Ippo's fight, this creative choice almost feels at odds or antithetical to the greater lesson of this matchup with Mashiba in the first place. Okay, so remember when I said that I really appreciated how this manga took a sport and didn't do supernatural things with the people participating outside the realms of possibility? I praised it for trying to tell a realistic boxing story. Well, Mashiba, without the ligaments in his elbow, used his normal guard with the elbow bent. Through sheer willpower and determination to not let his kid sister down, he performed a physiological miracle, which I suppose is appropriate to offset the incredibly dangerous and not at all worth it endeavor Ippo is trying to do now. I really don't know what to make of this. Normally this would be fine, but the way Mashiba's arm was demonstrated to be was as if he had no ability to lift it at all, like he lacked control over it, as if it were a limp limb. Mashiba ends up landing the flicker jab with his compromised left limb and lands a massive right straight to knock down Ippo. Throwing caution for his future into the wind, Ippo makes the 10 count and lands 3 massive right hooks to the body of Mashiba. But again, the psycho persists. I think at this point we've left the realms of reality. The way Ippo's punches have been built up, Mashiba should have every rib in his body broken, as well as a ruptured liver and kidneys given his lack of defense. It seems to me unthinkable to take that many clean shots to the body and not have the match called off, or let alone not go down once. And this I think would be permissible in any other story, but Hajime no Ippo has been great for staying within the realms of realism. And so the problem that arises therefore from this sudden shift in presentation is that now I have no clue how to gauge this fight's progress. So much time had been spent on establishing this sport and how it worked in the real world, but now we're veering into supernatural territory and thus has removed the realistic foundations and expectations we've built. But I don't know how much that matters because that shot was awesome. Ippo lands a massive uppercut, lifting Mashiba off the floor. Again, not very realistic, but there you go. And he's still standing there. Ippo lands another straight right, and finally he goes down. I gotta say, however, despite my criticisms, one aspect that has never let me down has been Morikawa's paneling. The way this entire section is demonstrated, the white to offset the complexity of each individual pose that he struck. Ippo wins, and it's in fantastic fashion. The post-fight reactions from Mashiba and Ippo are my favorite part of the fight. They're given wonderful drawings and tremendous revelations of their individual characters, but in the end, Ippo won. And boy, does he win everything. He wins the fight. He has 0 lasting consequences, it seems, from the rash actions he took in the 3rd round. He wins the tournament, wins this year's Most Excellent Boxer Award, which I didn't even know was a thing he could win up until the panel it was presented to him in. I was almost half expecting Mashiba's sister to push him out of the way and run onto the platform to embrace Ippo and say, "Ippo, I'm yours, please kiss me," or something like that. Honestly, it's almost comical how great everything ends up going for this character. The first chapter painted a very different picture, but since then, it's been nothing but W's for this guy. Outside of the obvious conflicts he's had physically with fighters, the closest thing Ippo has gotten to actual compelling character-defining conflict was the anger he displayed following MIYATA's loss, and he overcame that super easily in the end. The very first creative element in this story that caught my eye was the ring bell Morikawa illustrates at the beginning of the first chapter. And as it happens, it's something he illustrates at different points in the series, perhaps at the beginning of each volume. And I liked this creative choice because I thought it was a cute metaphor for what was to come. You see, a boxing match is divided into rounds, which begin and conclude at the sound of the bell ring. One of the things I love about boxing is that it can be looked at philosophically as a metaphor for life. As soon as that bell rings, you don't know what might come your way. You might be in control one moment and the next you're on the back foot. You might be cruising and the next you're struggling for the next gasp of air. The Rocky films communicate this philosophy well by describing life as a boxing match, that you have to keep picking yourself back up and move forward. That much like a ring bell, whether you're ready or not, life doesn't stop for anyone. And no one is going to hit you harder than life can. So when I saw that the first chapter began with a ringing bell, it reassured me, perhaps naively, that this story was going to be about more than just boxing. That it was going to be about life and the struggles one needs to fight through in order to come out on top. Take any substantial boxing-centric film from the last 40 years as an example. Raging Bull, Rocky, Creed, $1 Million Baby, The Fighter, Cinderella Man. All of these films use boxing as the fantastic metaphor for life that it is, and through it tells some of the best and most captivating human stories. And I think perhaps going in with that mindset set me up for disappointment. I should have gone in with no expectations. But this isn't to say that I didn't enjoy my time reading Hajime no Ippo. I had a ton of fun, in fact. Deciphering what Morikawa's approach was fascinating, and seeing the world through his eyes was captivating if nothing else. While I didn't fall in love with the main character, it's hard not to fall in love with the clear passion Morikawa has for this sport. The man even opened his own boxing gym in Tokyo, for God's sake. So while I can't say that Hajime no Ippo was the once-in-a-generation type story that I was hoping for, it was, at the end of the day, everything that it needed to be. A perfect vehicle to encourage those young and old alike to take up the beautiful sport that Morikawa loves so much. And in that same vein, I want to point each and every one of you out there who liked this story to stick with it and follow along with K-Manga Kodansha's release of it in English. We need to support official releases as English speakers. I don't want to stand for anything less. I read up until the end of the tournament, but there's even more released for you all to enjoy and check out right now. And hey, let them know that I sent you. I would love for there to be a time where YouTubers and actual license holders in Japan can work together and actually promote these things to our audiences. So please go to the description and check out and support the official release. You won't be disappointed.